All right, so welcome everyone. It's a nice size group that this can be really informal, so really feel free to jump in with questions and comments at any time. My name is Katie Graber, and Annalie Leptison and I are co-directors of Anabaptist Worship Network, and we are delighted to have Joanna Harader here to talk with us about this lovely new book, Expecting Emmanuel. And my congregation is actually really using it to structure the whole Advent season, but I think there's far more uses beyond that to incorporate it into lots of different types of worship services, even beyond Advent. Joanna has had other conversations about using this as a personal devotion and in other ways, but this is really tonight focused on how it can be used in corporate worship and worship planning. And we'll talk about songs from Voices Together that could go along with it as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Joanna to give us some opening words.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Part of the book, and honestly, my favorite part of the book is each section concludes with a blessing in the voice of the woman that the section is about, and then artwork, which are paper cutout pieces by artist Michelle Burkholder. So we wanted to open and close our session tonight with those images and words. So we'll begin with actually what is the end of the Christmas blessing. And I will share the screen so that you can see the piece that Michelle created for that as I read. And let me get the right button here. And all that God calls you to do and to be, may you have courage to say yes to the mystery. In times of excitement, grief, joy, and fear, may you have loved ones to offer companionship and blessing. In the labor of creation, may you be strong, may you be flexible, may you know joy. May you, beloved child, ponder deeply each divine message you hear, whether from angel or shepherd. May you ponder and treasure every gift you receive from the holy hand of God. Amen.
Awesome, thank you. So as Katie said, we have some questions that both Katie and I have kind of been thinking about that we think will be generally of interest. But if you have questions too, again, put them in the chat or unmute if that feels right too, and we can keep our conversation moving. So Joanna, just curious to kind of start out by hearing you talk a little bit about how the idea for the book came about and what kind of inspired you to write it.
Yeah, the favorite Advent series I ever preached was one that I did probably before I even graduated from seminary on the women of Jesus genealogy. And I was really excited to go back to that and know some of the folks at Herald Press, and they were really excited about the idea of an Advent devotional. That's something they were wanting to have more devotional material. And so I was just excited to spend time with these women and pray about them and think about them and dig into their stories. And then as a pastor, it made sense to me to create the book, not only as a personal devotional, but also as a congregational resource, and put the worship material in, because that is a type of writing that I love to do. And Michelle is a good friend of mine. I love Michelle's artwork, and I had that idea. Michelle graciously agreed to work with me on the project, and MennoMedia graciously agreed to rewrite the contract to include an artist and make it possible to have the art be a part of it, which I feel like is a really, it really adds a lot, I think, to the book to have the art there. So it's how it developed.
Out of curiosity, how many of our participants here have the book, so that we know how much background we need to give in terms of what is actually in it? Yeah, okay, let's talk a little bit about, can you just tell us, like, who are the women and where does this list come from, and what does each chapter include?
So probably the easiest thing is to show you the table of contents. So you can see how it's structured. So it starts with a general reflection on the genealogy, but then it goes through Tamar, Rahab, and I'm scrolling the wrong way here. And you can see that they're dated entries. So it starts with the earliest possible date for Advent, which is actually when Advent starts this year. We have as much Advent as we can possibly have in 2022. And they're different lengths. There's not a set length. Rahab is longer than Tamar, Ruth is longer, because the stories are different lengths. We have different biblical material. So Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, Mary, who comes both before and after Christmas. And then going up to Epiphany, we have Anna, the prophet Anna, the weeping mothers, and Sophia Wisdom. And then at the back of the book are the guides for group use. And for each individual entry, there is a biblical reference, not all of the biblical text, because they're pretty substantial chunks of text. They're not like a little verse to, embroider and hang on your wall. They're chunky stories to dig into, but then a reflection on that. And then for each reflection, there's some questions to consider, which can be personally considered or within a group context, and then a spiritual practice, using the term spiritual practice very broadly. That's the general structure of it.
I just put in the chat a link to buy the PDF that that Joanna has been projecting here, and it includes, as you saw, the table of contents and all of the artwork, right?
Yeah, actually, the table of contents is not in the PDF. That's just something I have. But the download includes all of Michelle's artwork and all of the text of the blessings that go with it.
So it can be used to project in worship or to photocopy, and so it could be useful both for the visuals and for the
yeah. And there are three different, in the one digital download, there's three different versions. There's the images by themselves that I'm using, but then there's also pages that have them on both sides. And one of them is formatted so you could have the image. If you have regular print bulletins, the image would be on the front and the blessing text would be on the back if you wanted to use those for your bulletins for Advent.
Are there any restrictions in terms of like my congregation prints the bulletins online, or not prints, stores our bulletins online? Is that okay?
That is something that we're still like, it's fine to send them digitally through email, but publishing the images online, I think, is beyond the copyright permissions that are granted. So
that makes sense, because
yeah,
then everybody could just,
because then everyone could just copy it. But sending it out in like a church email newsletter, or projecting it on the wall, or printing physical copies that are mailed to people or that people get in church, those are all fair use. You buy the copyright for that when you buy the digital download.
Awesome. Maybe kind of getting back a little bit more into the content of the book. We've kind of looked in that table of contents at the different women you highlight. Were there challenges in choosing who to highlight and working with some of these stories?
I mean, the nice thing about using the genealogy is that they're chosen for you in terms of which of the First Testament women to use. The more challenging piece was getting to Epiphany and choosing the New Testament female figures. And people have asked about Elizabeth, and I probably should have included Elizabeth, but I love Anna so much. And I think the weeping mothers are, I think that's a good voice to have in there. And Sophia is, I think it's important that we don't just think about the women as characters, but also we think about the feminine aspects of the divine herself. And that is what Sophia leads us into. So all in all, I think that works out. But there really are they're hard stories, for sure. And more than one of them deals with sexualized violence against these women, which I did have Harold Press did have a sensitivity reader who has expertise in that area and trauma, to look at the text to make sure, and she made some suggestions about some ways to phrase some things that would be more helpful, possibly for survivors who might be reading the text. So that was one of the more difficult things to think about. And then, of course, when you're converting, a lot of this stuff is just really, really great for digging into in Bible study, for example. But then when you're trying to frame it and put it in a framework for worship, there are other considerations. Like, for example, in the worship materials for children's time, my suggestion, which people can take or leave, but my suggestion is to focus on the concept of the genealogy and talk about Jesus' genealogy one Sunday, and then invite people from the congregation to share stories about someone and their genealogy who was a person of faith that they want to talk about. Because how do you talk to a 5-year-old about the rape of Bathsheba? I feel like you would have to sanitize the stories in some ways too much to make them like a children's time moment. So some of those pieces, and even just to preach on it in a worship context, you have to be very careful about how deep you go into that and be sensitive to the reactions that people might have. So
Do you have any wisdom on that? Or, I mean, the sensitivity reader, is there anything that you could pass on? Or was it more kind of localized than that?
yeah, I mean, the comments were more specific to the reflections, but of course you want to talk about these in ways that don't put shame on people who experience the violence, that don't talk about all the things that she should have done so that didn't happen to her. To, like, for Bathsheba, what happens a lot of times is that it's this bad thing or potentially bad thing happened, but look, she got to be a queen, so it was all part of God's plan. Like, someone experiencing a violation is not part of God's plan. So we need to be careful in talking about these stories, that it's not framed as God wants these terrible things to happen to us. So yeah, those are a few pieces, and there may be, in people need to know their particular context, and maybe you don't preach Bathsheba in your context, or maybe you don't preach the David and Bathsheba story, but you look more at the book talks. Also, it doesn't just focus on that story. We actually know quite a bit about Bathsheba. She became queen, and there are stories of her as queen, and you could focus on those pieces with Bathsheba.
So if you are talking about the difficult parts of the story in the context of waiting for Jesus, how can you do that without, like, ending up with, oh, but Jesus?
Oh, but Jesus. I mean, for me, what spending time with these women and their stories, the way it really, I say it drew me into Advent, but that the other just practical difficulty was that I had to finish the draft of this the day before Lent started. Like, I was just seized, like, liturgically upside down. But what really draws me into the Advent space is that these are such human stories, and what we are claiming through Advent and Christmas is the incarnation. And so I think that's where the connection is, right? I mean, God is God. God can make Jesus without, Tamar having to seduce her father-in-law. Like, that was not a necessary thing to happen for Jesus to exist in the history of the world. But the stories do really open up a lot about what it means to be human, and the complexities of that, and the messiness of that. And I think if we let ourselves, and if we let our people really look at that humanity for the weeks leading up to Christmas, it just makes the reality of the incarnation that much more incredible. that this is what God signed up for, to like be part of this humanity that is so hard.
Yeah, I love that. At my church, as I said, we're using this whole book, and we got together a group of planners, and one of the first things we did was go around the room and talk about what Advent has meant to us. And it was interesting that every single person talked about sort of mixed feelings in various ways. Like someone talked about dealing with seasonal affective disorder, and somebody else talked about just the sort of melancholy of both. You want it to come, but you don't want it to be over. Like once Christmas is over, then all of your family leaves. And so like all of these different ways of, we think about the longing and the waiting, but it's so much more than that. And so what you just described captures that really nicely. Does anyone else, any participants have questions or comments so far? Does anyone have specific questions like about how it may or could be used in your community?
And just to mention, we had talked a little bit about, you know, most churches already have their Advent theme set. And if this, you know, if you're not using the book as a whole for Advent, I think, you know, the blessings are still a piece that might be useful in a worship context. There are, like I said, each week has spiritual practices suggested, and in the small group Sunday school guide and retreat guide at the back of the book, there are some different themes suggested. One of the themes is spiritual practices, and that section lists some of the, points you back in the book to some of the practices that might work well in a group context. So some of those practices are ones that could be used in the congregation. And like there's a grieving ritual in there, which I always feel is an important for Advent. I think that's another thing that might be helpful with these, walking with these women during Advent, is that there is a lot of grief mixed in with the joy and the stories, and that's how we experience Advent. And sometimes it's how we internally experience Advent, but it's not always how we're externally expected to be during Advent. So there's a grieving ritual, a suggestion for like visual arts, drawing, prayers, Visio Divina, of course, with the images, a labyrinth suggestion. So some of those could be used. There's a prayer of confession and an offertory prayer, not specific to each Sunday, but just general Advent ones that aren't about the women's stories in particular. So there's some individual worship pieces that would work with more general Advent themes. And then of course the worship, so each worship section has a candle lighting, well, you can't really see, but it has a candle lighting ritual, like call to worship, candle lighting, and a benediction. And so the ones for Christmas and Epiphany are the Christmas and Epiphany stories, which are probably what you're using, whatever RCL narrative lectionary, whatever, you're probably looking at Luke 2 sometime around Christmas, and Matthew sometime around Epiphany. So those could have some relevant material, whatever you're using for your themes.
Awesome. So you mentioned Visio Divina, of course, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about using the art, and maybe for folks who aren't super familiar with Visio Divina, a little bit more about using that.
Yeah. So the art is, Michelle received the words of blessing that I wrote and created the art based on those. And then, yeah, we talked kind of in the download, and I was going to mention the art quality in the book itself is a little bit disappointing. The images are much clearer and the digital download. And so that could be a piece that's projected. I believe there are some congregations, because Mennonites love to make banners, and I think there are some congregations that are actually creating I don't know if they're making, like, cutting out the pieces to make the banner or blowing it up, really big at a coffee shop, but there are some congregations that are creating hard copies in some form of the images to put up at the front during Advent. And then, Visio Divina, in its most simple form, it could just be a time of silence where people are invited to look at the image and think about it in a prayerful space. And it can have more specific questions, like with Lectio Divina, when we're using the word, meditating on the words of scripture, there can be more specific questions to focus on a particular part of the image that draws you in, and then to look at the image of a whole and to consider what the Spirit might be saying to you through that, or what questions are arising. And then with the possibility of even having people share some of their thoughts or insights with people around them or with the group as a whole. So I've seen that done different ways in different congregations, but I think it can add a lot to the worship experience, especially for folks who aren't highly verbal and need that visual input.
There's also, for folks who are using Voices Together, there's the Worship Leader Edition, which includes an entry on Visio Divina. So some folks, if you are looking for kind of a step-by-step how-to, that is also a really cool thing to pair with this resource. So
yeah,
awesome.
Also, speaking of Voices Together, Annalie and I made a list of
Jillian
songs.
has a hand up.
What's that?
We have a raised hand.
Oh, okay. I didn't see. Oh, yeah.
Hi. So, Joanna, one of the themes I heard you talk about. So if we think about Advent as being about, the preparation for God with us in Emmanuel, are there any other themes that you could see, overarching themes? Because I'm thinking, for me, one of the ways to go might be to pick a theme and then speak to how each of these women's experiences bear out that theme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Emmanuel would work really well and be really interesting, because these women have really different stories, and so we see God's presence in their lives in really different ways. So I think that could be a really cool window into it. There's definitely a thread of marginalization. There's definitely a thread of survival. I mean, people doing just what they need to do to make life happen, and really a lot of this. I think these stories speak a lot against shame, and we see women who aren't receiving the shame that the culture is kind of trying to put on them in different ways. I don't know that shame would be a very uplifting Advent theme, but I think we see it in the stories for sure. Parenting you really can't do, because even though these women were all mothers because they're in the genealogy, their stories, except for Bathsheba's, they're really not stories about the parenting so much, but there's certainly nurture and care in them that could be looked at. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Thanks for the answer.
Cheryl, go ahead.
I was thinking as Joanna was talking that something she said, maybe, anyway, I was just thinking that each of the women in their own way were God incarnate to someone around them. And maybe God incarnate's too strong, but they were, showed God to people around them.
Agents of God's grace.
Yes, that's a very good way to put it.
I heard this interview once with a poet, and I can't remember who it was. It might have been Mary Howe, and she was talking about her her becoming a Roman Catholic when she was in her 40s, I believe. And, she said she was sitting in church one night and the crucifix was there, and here's the nearly naked Jesus hanging on the cross. And she was thinking about the word incarnate and thinking, oh, it's kind of like chili con carne, chili with meat. And she thought, look at him hanging up there. He's just a hunk of meat like me. And I think it would be sort of interesting to play with that theme, the incarnational nature of these women and the things that they did in their lives that led to the ultimate incarnation. Maybe that's what I'll do.
Yeah, there you go. And I'll have to find your sermons online so I can hear them. That sounds great.
That is awesome. I love this. I love the kind of sharing of ideas. There's so many ways, different directions you can go with these resources, which is so exciting. So speaking of that, Katie and I have put together these song suggestions. Some of them, this is not like a perfectly edited document, so some of them have little kind of references of what we were thinking, and others we just kind of, there was like a theme we could see connecting. And I hope some of the themes are fairly obvious. Not everyone has read the book, but you can kind of pull different things from them. So some of them, like the first one here for Tamar, just even the mention of Tamar in Voices Together feels exciting. And so some of them, it's just a simple kind of reference that's helpful to highlight. But we did talk about this kind of shame theme. And so some of these have kind of references to shame. And also the kind of waiting, Poor of the Earth is Christmas Advent piece, as is We Come, Our Hearts Are Empty. Both of them have that kind of we come, our hearts are empty, we come, we cry, we watch, we wait. Very much an Advent kind of theme that fits in with the narrative of Tamar. So those are some of the ones we thought of for that one. If you want to talk about Rahab, Katie.
Rahab had themes of marginalization and faithfulness throughout her story, and so these are kind of finding ways and finding God's faithfulness, as well as Christ Has Broken Down the Wall is about resisting marginalization. And maybe we can mention here a couple things. Earlier, we talked a little bit about not making everyone's story, everyone's pain leading to redemption or the coming of Jesus. So even Christ Has Broken Down the Wall. If we use, obviously we're going to be talking about Jesus during Advent, but we need to just do that carefully so that it's not that, well, Jesus came and fixed everything, Christ broke down the walls, so Rahab, there aren't stories like Rahab anymore, because there are, right? There are still these human stories that we can connect to these human women. And so finding a way to present the connections and present our the hope in Jesus without erasing the pain of the stories, I think is really important. Yeah. And then also, just really quickly, all of these songs, most of them are not Advent songs. So Annalie and I were specifically trying to think of songs that you might not come across if you're just flipping through the Advent section. And so this is just a starting place, and kind of lots of, sometimes it might even feel like it's reaching to make the connection, but just to open up everybody's creativity and thoughts about what kinds of songs could go with these.
And Katie, how can people access this list so they're not frantically writing down hymn numbers?
Yeah, I'll put the link in the chat.
And if you ever lose it or someone else wants, you can share it with anyone. You've got viewer access, but you can always email us the email that you saw, however you found this webinar, awn@ambs.edu, and we can resend it to you if that's helpful. And we may post it in the Anabaptist Worship Network group too, for folks who couldn't be here and that kind of thing. So it's definitely meant to be circulated and helpful for you, however that works.
But also don't take it as like the end all. Do your own searching
Yeah.
and find the resonances that you find.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ruth, Hope of Abraham and Sarah, Bless the Arms That Comfort, both mention Ruth. Lord Jesus, you shall be my song as I journey. Obviously, a significant kind of journey theme in Ruth's story. I like the addition of Your Grace Finds Me. Obviously, I mean, Katie and I, connected to our voices together work, are often thinking about amplifying different kind of idioms, songs from around the world, the voices of women in tune writing and text writing. So that's something else kind of cool to think about if you're using this as a series this year or next year, or throughout the year, finding women's voices that also reflect on these. And Your Grace Finds Me is a contemporary song, so that it doesn't have really like crisp text connections, but it kind of talks about the kind of endlessness of God's grace, from the newborn cry to the grave side, kind of. And so that's a cool connection with a kind of a different idiomatic feel.
And the first one under Bathsheba is, you could say all those same things. When I Can't Find My Way is written by an Anabaptist woman, and it's more contemporary style. All of these actually under Bathsheba are either trauma or like ways to deal with trauma. So, I mean, you can just go through these on your own if you want to look at them more clearly. But like, How Can Our Anger Give Life, number 792, is a very short song. That's the whole text. How can our anger give life? So finding this list is like many different ways to deal with lament or deal with trauma and tragedy.
And I think we didn't highlight, I mean, there's so many beautiful words that can be used for worship in the book, so we don't have worship resources on this list, but to connect to, there's really beautiful worship resources also in Voices Together, if that's helpful to have. I'm thinking of Rain Come Down, which was written in response to a really awful community tragedy, and kind of making space for grief, and there's also a prayer for a community crisis in the worship resources. So if those are themes, that kind of grief and tragedy that end up being explored, definitely check out worship resources as well. Mary, okay, this is like the easy one in terms of like, there's so many. So lots of Magnificat settings, and other kind of references. Some of them are a bit more obvious, but going back to the parenting connection, Mother and God, You Gave Me Birth is a kind of an interesting connection, especially with Advent too. Hacia Belen is written, has Spanish verses, and so that's again, using other languages is kind of a cool way of expanding our understanding of these stories. Yeah.
Wisdom from on High is to the tune of Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence. So it's a tune that we associate with Advent. These words aren't necessarily only Advent, but this beautiful image, the hidden womb who birthed the heavens, in the womb now hides away, during Advent, is a really cool image. Do
you want the last one? Mary, I think it's you, but I can go.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. Anna, Weeping Mothers and Wisdom. Again, kind of connections to, well, there's certainly the grief kind of angle. When Pain or Sorrow, Hold On has been a big kind of, has really resonated with people in circumstances of grief. The kind of
feminine imagery of God is, or the
right.
feminine Christ is in that section as well. So the first two are feminine images of God.
Yeah. And then also the theme of like guidance and direction, which we see in My Lighthouse, Lead Me, Guide Me. And of course, with any of those themes that we just talked about, there would be many more pieces you could choose. Yeah. And then just ways to search, again, like Katie mentioned, do your own searches and see what resonates that we didn't pull out. There is so much. So the scriptural allusions and references index is so helpful if you have a specific scripture passage that you're looking for, or one that you think might have a connection that you can pull from. topics and uses in worship. I feel like I open that once a day. On my Voices Together app, I just shortcut it. And then the table of contents. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting to compare. If you look up in the topic and uses in worship index and go to lament, it's slightly different than if you go to the table of contents praying lament section. So if you try to find ways to kind of cross reference those, and you might come across something that you wouldn't have normally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you have that now. You put it in the chat, Katie, I think?
I did, yeah.
Great. So you have that, and you can always reach out if you lose it. Feel free to use those suggestions, but again, definitely go your own directions with them. Are there other questions that have come up about using this in worship or the book in general or the process? Anything else folks are kind of wondering about?
I'm curious. After this finishes, how do I get back in? How do I get back to the chat, to the link?
So you'd have to open the link now, and then it'll be open on your computer, and then when we close the meeting, it'll still be open.
Okay. Oh, my phone. Okay.
Or email.
Yeah.
Emily or Katie.
Yeah, that's what I'll do.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're on your phone, it gets tricky to copy
I can
and
just
paste.
send it your way, Anne. I'll do that right when we're done.
That's fine. That's great. Also, is this typically the Mennonite Church has a, creates an Advent resource?
Oh.
Is this what's being used this year?
No, this is a separately published one. So I actually just got my email today for the Worship at Home materials. Leader magazine is usually
Yeah.
the worship material, and then I think it's Common Word that creates the family, the at-home version. I'm not sure, but this is a separate piece. The leader material, I believe, always uses the Revised Common Lectionary scriptures.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, well, in terms of working with the congregation, I wanted to make sure what was coming, see what was coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a good resource.
Yeah. And I know, like, with the song suggestions, I saw that First Mennonite in Bluffton, I believe they're using There's a Line of Women every week of Advent. That's kind of their lead-in song. And they're doing the same thing, Katie, that your church is, with having 7 women preach each Sunday about the different women. So yeah, great Mennonite minds think alike, I guess.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, but as we were saying earlier, even if your congregation uses the leader material, which is not related specifically to this, these are still women that are in the story, and they are still women with powerful stories that you could draw in some of the ideas or themes or blessings and readings and things from this book, even if you're not.
Yeah, and these are not like Christmassy story, like, these are also stories that you could explore at times other than Advent. You could do a summer series on women in the Bible and include these as some of the women that you might look at. For example, there's a little bit of referencing to the Advent season in the individual daily devotionals, because I expect people will be reading those specifically during Advent. But in terms of creating worship, I think that, it would be very possible to do it at another time of year. These women's stories are valuable in their own right, not just because they're in the genealogy. To me, it's just fascinating that they made it into the genealogy in the first place, that any women's names are listed in Matthew. Luke doesn't list them. And Rahab is mentioned. She's mentioned 3 times in the New Testament, which is astounding considering who she was. So I've been paying more attention to Rahab and trying to figure out what was her role in the first century Jewish and early Christian community, that she had the status with Abraham to be named in the list of the faithful ones.
I could see so much of what you've written. You know, you mentioned it's a devotional mostly intended for Advent, but as I was reading some of them, I was like, this would be such good. I'm not actively regularly preaching, but if I was writing sermons, there's so much fuel there to help shape a sermon or a reflection that is certainly not tied to Advent. So I could see some of your reflections are just like gold mines for further thinking.
Yeah, I mean, as a process note, like I really wasn't, like I said, it was Lent. I wasn't super in the Advent mindset. That was something that they actually made me go back and do. They're like, this is an Advent devotional. You need to like connect it back to Advent. Because I just was in the women's stories, and we talked about this, like how do you preach the First Testament during Advent in a way that honors, in a way that looks towards Jesus, because that's what we as Christians are looking towards and waiting for, and also a way that honors the Jewish faith, the Jewish community of these women that we're reading about. Well, not Rahab. Yeah, Rahab wasn't even Jewish to begin with, or and you know, and that's kind of tricky, but really it's an exploration of their stories, and the stories are pretty timeless. We use them in certain seasons, but there's so much there for anything. And I see everyone, as far as I can tell on my screen, we have exclusively or almost exclusively female identifying folks here. And that's a danger of writing about women. And I just feel like I have to say to everyone, like, this is not, I mean, it's great for women to read this book, but it is not a book intended only for women. And frankly, a lot of men probably need to read it more than a lot of women do. So I would encourage you in your church contexts to, don't just, if you're excited about it, maybe suggest it to a broad group, and not just take it back to your women's group or whatever. Because I think women hear and study stories of the men in the Bible all the time, but somehow when a book comes out about the women in the Bible, it's kind of pigeonholed in this, like, as being only for women. And that was not my intent with this book. And I hope it has a broader audience than that. So.
And Joanna, am I right that you're doing a weekly devotional meeting during Advent? Is that open to everyone?
Yes, thank you. I forgot. I'm doing a starting with the Monday before the first Sunday of Advent at 11 o'clock Central Time. There'll be a Zoom gathering. I mean, anyone can come. It's designed for people who are leading, who are using this in a group context, who are kind of preparing to preach on it or to lead a group through it. And we'll just gather for about an hour to pray together and just share our thoughts about how we might approach it, what we think we might say. On the weeks that there's some difficult topics, we may end up, talking some about how we can approach those. I'll put my email in the chat, and the very sophisticated system I have for you getting the Zoom link is to email me and I'll send it to you. So.
Awesome.
And like, I know Katie is just preaching one Sunday. And so I've told her, like, you can just come the week, the Monday before the Sunday you're preaching. It's not like my feelings will be hurt if you don't show up again. If you're preaching one Sunday, just come that Sunday or that Monday before, so you can have some different people prepare in different ways. But I very much benefit from conversation about a text that I'm going to be teaching or preaching. So.
Awesome. Good. Well, we have one more blessing to kind of close us out. Joanna, if you want to lead us in that.
All right.
Do we want to ask one more time if there's any questions? Just to make sure no one feels like they got cut off.
Yes, sure.
All right. And you have, so Joanna put her email in the chat, so you can send her any questions you think of later.
For sure. All right. This is Sophia's blessing. I love Sophia very much. All right. And I love this. I love this. This was the first piece Michelle sent me, and I just fell in love and was so excited. So, and this is in the voice of Sophia. My love, you are a delight, like watching springs bubble up and hills emerge, like feeling the first fertile soil and seeing tiny green sprouts, like gasping in wonder as stars fill the sky and ocean waves lap against immeasurable sand. You are a delight and a joy, my love. So the blessing I offer is a simple one. Be who you are. Be what you have been intended to be since the beginning of all things. Be what I have created you to be. Delightful, delighted, light, life, love.